Kate Walz is the Director of Housing Justice at the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, and Debbie Chizewer is a professor at the Advocacy Center at Northwestern University Law School. Thanks for joining us, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's about a year ago that Mayor Anthony Copeland sent a letter to the residents of the West Calumet Housing Complex in East Chicago telling them that he had plans to tear the complex down because of extremely high levels of lead contamination in the soil. How did y'all first hear about that?
We heard about it, or the Shriver Center heard about it on the news, and we were concerned with some of the things that he was saying. We do a lot of work with respect to public housing and know the rules in terms of demolition. And so it piqued our interest, and we were concerned that the families may not have been receiving all the information about their rights with respect to public housing demolition.
Well, I actually was contacted by a peer at University of Chicago Abrams Environmental Law Clinic who had gone on the toxic tour with Thomas Frank, an activist in East Chicago, and said I wanted to let me know that he had done that, and then quickly followed up and said this is going to be a big issue, and it piqued our interest. And so at the same time I heard from Kate in my role at the Shriver Center as the board chair, and so we all went to Mayor Copeland's meeting.
And you're both involved in different pieces of litigation and legal actions. I mean, can you kind of sum up how many different parts there are to this that are going on right now?
From housing, it was concern that the families were being pushed out without the relocation assistance they were entitled to under federal law. It was the civil rights implications of pushing them out without a real plan in place. It was the concern that some families had already moved out before being given the chance to receive a housing choice voucher, because we had a few families who had their children tested for lead, found that they had elevated blood lead levels, went to the housing authority and said, my child has lead poisoning, can you please help me? And the housing authority staff said they knew nothing about it. And so out of concern for their children, they left. So there were many things that we had to do from a housing, civil rights, and relocation perspective to protect families. And so it's been at some parts over the last year, on a daily basis, it's multiple points of advocacy to try to bring justice for this community and on their behalf.
Yeah, I mean, the housing aspect of this being on a Superfund site, as far as we can tell, is fairly rare, if not unique. I mean, is that a piece of this that sort of necessitates maybe more legal action than a similar situation in other places would require?
We needed to ensure that there was a relocation program that gave the families a meaningful opportunity to move somewhere else that potentially would be a healthier community. And I have to say that, I'm a parent of 2 children, and it was hard on a personal level to think through hearing the level of contamination at this site. You had this sort of reaction of, my gosh, people should leave quickly. So I understood where that came from. But in speaking with the families, we also really heard that they needed time, to figure out where they would be employed in the future, what schooling would look like, and what type of community they wanted to be in the future. And so we saw an opportunity to provide that support to them so that their goals for themselves, their families, and their communities could be achieved.
Is there a moment over the past year that's really shocked you, or maybe more than anything else you've experienced working on these cases?
Some of the actions by the housing authority, where they have stated publicly that their actions were out of concern for the families, I was continually surprised and disappointed that they weren't taking the opportunity to actually act in a way on behalf of the families. That there was oftentimes, that played out unfortunately even in the press, this sort of us versus them mentality, rather than we should have a shared objective of moving families to better communities.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've heard over and over from residents is about sort of this division that exists, whether it's among residents of the Superfund site and other residents of the city, or between city residents and local government. I mean, what do you think it is about this situation that's caused that division between people?
With regard to the housing authority or other government agencies and the community, I think that because of the way this unfolded, with a very quick plan that didn't really account for a meaningful process, that it quickly put the mayor and the East Chicago Housing Authority on their heels.
Yeah.
And so that instantly led to an approach to crisis that I might not choose, which is to just, to build walls around themselves.
Yeah, the EPA reported some elevated levels of lead in the drinking water that they think comes from the service lines that are throughout the city. Has there been any progress on that front with either more testing or replacing service lines?
Well, as you might remember, NRDC filed a petition on behalf of 17 groups early March, I want to say March 2nd or 3rd, and EPA has still not formally answered that petition, which is very disappointing. In the meantime, the city has continued to say that the drinking water is safe in the city, and the state decided to do its own testing outside of the Superfund site largely. I think they included one home on the Superfund site to evaluate East Chicago's testing protocol, and they called it the Lead and Copper Rule Plus. And and that's the Indiana Department of Environmental Management item did that testing, and based on its testing, it concluded that the drinking water outside the Superfund site was safe, but EPA has not. EPA didn't weigh in on the protocol that the item used, and EPA hasn't said we agree with this testing yet. And we think that the testing that item did is more like comparing apples to oranges, because they did not use the sequential testing, which is a more involved method that EPA, which is the state-of-the-art method in which EPA used. So it's hard to compare their results. So the answer is we still don't know. EPA at its last public meeting actually refused to answer the question of whether the drinking water was safe. And when you have, whether that was out of closing walls again or something else, when you have that situation, you're not thinking about public needs and communication. How would you feel if you were a resident in that city and you were told, we can't say whether or not your drinking water is safe?
Both of you work very intimately with residents in East Chicago and go down there a lot. What has it been like being able to come back to Chicago where you live, just personally?
The importance of the environment, quite frankly, I mean, just from a personal level, that I saw these cases historically just from the perspective of housing and through a civil rights lens. But I had really ignored what it means to live in a healthy community. And I, at one point, was attending a community meeting, and my husband dropped me off, and our then 7-year-old son was with us. And this was when everything was coming out, and the meeting was at Carrie Gosh. And I turned to my husband and said, "Don't even let him get out of the car." And so I really feel for the families, because they didn't have a choice, and in many cases still don't. And I did. And I continue to have that privilege. And so it's been humbling, and it's an honor to work in the East Chicago community. And I've seen some amazing leadership, and I know Debbie has too, come out of this tragedy where residents have every reason just to curl up in a ball, and they haven't. And it's not only that they've advocated for their own families, but for their community, for other zones, and have in some cases become national leaders in the environmental justice movement.
In awe of the residents, and so I go home with that feeling of I'm well, and knock on wood, and just get tired. And it's amazing to me that the residents who I meet are going through so many health struggles as a result of living on the site, yet they come out week after week and they just keep going. And it drives me to go, it pushes me to go harder because I want to live up to their standard.
So y'all both started working on this about a year ago. When you first started, where did you think you would be a year from then?
I honestly thought, because when the mayor did his meeting at the site after the letter last August, and the plan as described was so sort of out of whack with federal law and regulations with respect to public housing relocation, I thought I will call the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and have a conversation with them and maybe a letter exchange, and they will correct this and the type of relocation program that they know how to build and they have in many, many, many other cases around the country will be created.
That it would happen relatively quickly.
It would happen relatively quickly. And when it didn't, and we realized that more direct action needed to be taken, even then I thought that the settlement of the case then would sort of be the end of it, that people would comply and the residents would get the services that they're entitled to and need. And so the amount of advocacy surprised me, but I don't regret it at all because I'm richer for it as an advocate in person that I've been able to be part of this process. And I have to say, in talking to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, I think that even that staff will tell you that they have learned some lessons from this and that they're figuring out how to create better relocation programs in other cases where families need to move, so that their goal is a shared goal of ensuring that families, if they choose, move to better, healthier communities.
You know, we're used to Superfund sites and issues relating to them take years. Unfortunately, it's one of the problems of the Superfund program. But before I talk about that more, I want to say one of the lessons that I think HUD and EPA learned was that they need to communicate with each other better, and so they did create this memorandum of understanding as a result of the East Chicago work, where they will let each other know, and so that there will be testing done and reporting back to each other, so we won't have more cases where this goes on for decades. Hopefully, we won't have more cases where this goes on for decades and decades without proper care.
Is that specifically for the work in East Chicago, or is that a national policy?
They said that it stemmed from the work in East Chicago, but it's a national policy.